March 10th, 1968, Fillmore East, New York. Jimi Hendrix raised his hand and the band stopped. Not because something went wrong, not because a string broke or a monitor cut out. He raised his hand because something coming from the concrete corridor behind the stage made a sound he had never heard from another human being. A bend. His bend. The one nobody could explain, nobody could teach, and nobody, in 12 years of watching guitarists try to copy him, had ever gotten right. He set his Stratocaster on the stand and walked toward the sound without saying a word. That morning, Gary Mitchell had been at the Fillmore since 6. Stage crew. He liked the empty hours before a venue came alive. The cold air off the concrete, the smell of old cable, the silence before the PA hiss crept in. He had hands that told the whole story. Swollen knuckles, a thumbnail that had been black for 2 months, calluses in the wrong places. He smelled like WD-40 before noon and cigarettes after. It was honest. His son Danny was 9 years old and had Gary's fingers. Long, thin, a little out of proportion with the rest of him. He had Down syndrome. Round face, wide blue eyes that went very still when something held his attention. Most things didn't hold it for long, but a few things stopped him completely. His father's hands were one. Music was the other. Gary spread a blanket in the far corner of the service corridor that morning, set down a coloring book, a thermos of orange juice, and the old guitar. A battered thing he'd bought for $15 from a second-hand shop on West 4th. The neck bowed slightly, the action sat too high. The body smelled of cheap glue. He'd restrung it the week before. "Stay here," he told Danny. "I'll check on you every hour." Danny nodded without looking up. He was already opening the coloring book. The guitar had been Gary's idea, but it started with the radio. About 8 months back, on a Thursday evening, Gary was making dinner. Chicken he'd cut too thin, onions in the pan, radio on low the way it always was. He wasn't really listening. He was thinking about the rent. Then Little Wing came through the speaker. He noticed Danny had gone still before he noticed the song. The boy had been moving the salt shaker back and forth across the table, a habit he had, steady, rhythmic. Then his hand stopped. The shaker stayed where it was. Danny's whole body turned toward the sound, slow, like a plant turning toward light, every part of him given over to it. Gary turned down the stove and watched. Danny sat like that until the song was over. Then he looked at his father with an expression Gary had learned to read over 9 years. It wasn't a question exactly, more like a fact being stated. Again. By the following week, Gary had noticed something. In the evenings, passing Danny's room, he'd hear a sound. Low, stopping and starting. Danny pressing his fingertips against the wall, against the edge of his mattress. Running them along surfaces. Gary understood what he was looking for. The $15 guitar appeared 2 weeks later. Gary skipped lunch 4 days in a row and didn't get his boot sole reglued. On Saturday, he walked into the second-hand shop and paid cash. That night, after Danny was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table and tried to learn Little Wing. Bills pushed to one side. Radio on low. He found the melody in a few days. The rhythm took longer, but the bend, that sliding upward pull, Jimmy put into certain notes, the one that made the guitar sound like it was about to say something, and thought better of it. Gary couldn't get it. 3 weeks on that one movement. His fingers knew where to go, but the string never moved right. It came out flat or went too far or just sounded like a mistake. He didn't quit. He came back to that table every night. The lamp threw yellow light across the formica, a cigarette in the ashtray. That one bend he could not nail. He started teaching Danny the parts he could play. Open strings, single notes, the shape of the melody without the bends. Danny's fingers were short but precise, and he learned things quietly. Gary would show a position, Danny would watch, then try. Sometimes he'd come back to something a day later and just have it. They didn't talk much while they played. They didn't need to. By March 1968, Danny could play most of Little Wing. The bends he'd go around, land on the next note, carry on. It was a 9-year-old with a $15 guitar learning by ear, which meant it was entirely his own. At the Fillmore that morning, around noon, the coloring book ran out. Danny sat on an equipment case, swinging his legs. Sounds drifted from the stage end of the corridor. A guitar being tuned, a kick drum hit, someone testing a microphone with slow flat taps. Danny slid off the case and walked toward the sounds. Not fast. No particular plan. He stopped at the corridor wall, put one hand flat on the concrete, then sat down on the floor, pulled the small guitar from its bag, and started playing. The first few notes were careful. He found his place in the song the way he always did. Not from the beginning, but from wherever his hands remembered. The melody settled and he moved through it. The Fillmore service corridor was concrete and low-ceilinged. Sound sat different in there. A little harder, closer to your ear. When Danny hit the bend, not the approximation, not the ghost of it, but the actual thing, string pulling up a quarter tone the exact way it did on the record. The note filled that corridor like it had been waiting for it. He wasn't trying for it. His finger just moved the way it had always moved. The way he'd heard it on the radio. The way it had lived in his hands without anyone putting it there. On stage, Jimmy's hand went up. The drummer stopped. The bass player looked up. Jimmy was already walking. He slowed as he got closer. The sound was fragile and he didn't want to break it. When he came around the corner, he saw a boy sitting against the wall, a small guitar across his lap, eyes closed, moving through a song Jimmy had written in a London hotel room 14 months ago. He stood and listened. The bend came again. Jimmy had never heard anyone play it back to him like that. Not session players, not the guitarists who'd been studying his records since Are You Experienced came out. That bend wasn't on any sheet music. It had come out of his hands in the studio and stayed there. Part of the song, the way an accent is part of a voice. You can hear it, you cannot teach it. And this boy was sitting on a concrete floor playing it. When Danny opened his eyes and found a man standing in the corridor, his gaze dropped to the floor immediately. The reflex of someone who had learned that strangers meant discomfort. Jimmy crouched down, got level with him. "That bend," he said, quiet. "Where'd you learn that?" Danny didn't answer. "Your daddy show you?" Something shifted in the boy's face. Not a smile. More like recognition of something familiar. "Daddy plays," Danny said. First words to a stranger and longer than Gary could count. Fast footsteps came from the far end of the corridor. Gary came around the corner and stopped cold. His son was sitting on the floor talking to Jimi Hendrix. 9 years. He had never seen Danny do that with anyone. "Danny," his voice came out wrong. Danny looked at his father, then at the man in the black coat, and then back at his father. "The radio man, Daddy." Gary took his cap off. He didn't know what to do with his hands. Jimmy stood and introduced himself like it needed doing. Gary said his name, his job, why Danny was in the corridor. Then Jimmy asked one thing Gary wasn't ready for. "That bend he's playing, you teach him that?" Gary almost laughed. "I tried to learn it myself for 8 months and never got it. He stopped. "He heard it on the radio. I don't know how he has it." Jimmy was quiet for a moment. "I know how he has it." He didn't explain. He looked at Danny, who had gone back to running his fingers along the strings without pressing them down, feeling the vibration through the wood. "Does he play in front of people?" "Just me." "You want him to play with me tonight?" Gary looked at his son, at the $15 guitar, at the bowed neck and the restrung frets, then at Jimmy. "There are 2,600 people in that room." "I know. Danny doesn't. He doesn't do strangers." Jimmy nodded slowly. "He did just now." At 8 o'clock, Jimmy walked to the microphone and said he had someone with him tonight. Danny came out from the wings holding the small guitar. White shirt, hair that hadn't cooperated with the comb Gary had run through it backstage. He walked to the chair someone had placed at the front of the stage and sat down. He didn't look at the audience. He looked at the guitar. Jimmy started Little Wing, half speed. No effects, no wah pedal, no sustain. Just the notes themselves. Danny sat with his eyes closed. 5 seconds passed, 8, 10. Then his fingers moved. The woman in the fourth row set her drink on the floor without looking at it. The sound engineer took his hand off the board. The light operator at the side of the stage went still. Danny played the melody the way he always played it, on his own time, in no particular hurry. When the bend came, he didn't rush it. His finger just moved the way it always moved. And the sound it made in the Fillmore East was fuller than it had ever been in the kitchen. More certain, like something that had always belonged in a room that size. Jimmy followed him, not the other way around. He slowed where Danny slowed, rested where Danny rested, found the bend when Danny found it, and held it exactly as long. Nobody in the room spoke. Near the end of the song, Danny opened his eyes. He didn't look at the crowd. He turned toward the wings where his father was standing with his arms at his sides. Gary was watching his son's left hand. That hand had the bend, the one he'd sat at that kitchen table trying to find for 8 months, the one that had beaten him night after night until he'd started to wonder if he'd ever get close. His son's finger was moving on a stage, and it had the bend, clean and certain, like it had always lived there, which it had. Danny played it one more time, eyes on his father. Gary understood. He didn't make a sound. He leaned against the wall and let out a breath that had been sitting somewhere low in his chest for a long time. His eyes were wet and he let them be. After the show, Jimmy sat with them backstage. No cameras, no one taking notes. At some point, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a guitar pick. Tortoise shell, edges worn soft. JAH scratched into the surface. He put it in Danny's palm. Danny closed his fist around it and didn't open it again that night. Gary kept the guitar the rest of his life, the $15 one, bowed neck and all. He stopped trying to learn the bend around the time Danny got it. After a few years, he could explain why that felt right. He told the story often, to neighbors, people at bars, younger guys on whatever crew he was working with. He always stopped in the same place. Danny on that stage, eyes on him, playing the bend Gary had spent 8 months failing to find. Every single time, he had to wait before he could finish the sentence. Because that was the thing that rewrote everything backward. Not the stage, not the crowd, not Jimi Hendrix 3 feet away. Just his boy looking at him and giving back the one thing Gary had never been able to give first. Turns out Danny had found it on his own. On the radio, in the kitchen, in the quiet of his own room. He'd had it the whole time. If you felt what happened in that corridor, leave a comment. And if these kinds of stories mean something to you, subscribe. This channel is just getting started.